So first, like I say, working on the planet Earth, I became aware of the myriad problems. And then as I looked at the world with that new awareness, I became aware that we were not engaging. We were not only making no progress, we weren't even starting to deal with any of these problems. For a time, I was a raving activist and joined organizations and made speeches and wrote articles and ran in circles. And by the end of the 90s, I was pretty much played out, and I saw no progress, and I thought, you know what? We've already lost this one. It's too late now. And everywhere I looked, it seemed to me that it was too late. And that's when I started work on Brace for Impact.
I'm Dean Walker, and welcome to the Poetry of Predicament podcast, a podcast for people brave enough to face humanity's challenges and problems, and most importantly, our numerous predicaments. The Poetry of Predicament is a podcast meant to inspire us to bring forth grace, beauty, and connection with the web of life in the face of a predicament-laden world. In this episode of the Poetry of Predicament podcast, let's welcome Tom Lewis. He's the founder of and blogger on Daily Impact, his blog and website. And he's been watching these events unfold for almost 50 years. A little bit of historical context with Tom Lewis.
Right. All right. Well, I'm ready when you are, Professor.
All right. May I call you Tom?
Call me anything you want to.
All right.
You go by Dean?
I do, yeah. And Tom, would it be right for me to introduce myself a little bit so you can know what the heck we're doing here and what
Certainly.
I do?
Certainly.
Okay. Well, about 7 years ago, I was really winding down a lifetime career mostly in training and development work, like corporate work, working with executives and so on. Also training work with community service projects with at-risk youth, and also another kind of training working with couples and intimacy and that sort of stuff. So a lot of that training stuff. And again, I was winding it down about 7 years ago, but then I got exposed to some information about abrupt climate change, and I realized that this was either the wackiest BS to ever come down the pike, or this is going to be the transformation of humanity, whether we were ready for it or not. And I vetted the latter, and I set about learning how to learn about not only the climate change thing, but also the large number of other measures of our impact on the planet, on both human and Earth systems. And I wrote a book about that. In 2017, it's called The Impossible Conversation. And, the punchline in the book was that I saw that we had really passed all the easier off-ramps that had come decades before. And what there was for me to do, just out of my own choice, was not to fix or save anything or anybody, but to offer whatever I could to bring a little bit more grace and beauty and perhaps some love and some service to people, given what I know how to do. So that's why I put together this website. That's why I continued with the book and this podcast, and offering coaching to people is basically to provide support and resources to people who are themselves clear that what we're in right now is the collapse of Earth and human systems, human-caused collapse. And and so that's the short version of the story. And then, why I call on people like yourself that I happen to bump into. I believe it's called Apocalypse Now, a recent article from you, and you know,
It was Apocalypse Now, question mark.
right, right. I particularly appreciate when someone has a track record of having been involved with this conversation, the most important conversation in human history, for longer than a few weeks or months.
Mm-hmm.
And I noticed that when I checked in on your website and looked back, what I saw was somewhere around 2009, 2010, you really started to make the blog happen in one form or another.
Well, that 2009 was the year I published Brace for Impact.
Right, right. And I'm sorry I have not read that yet, and I'm happy to when, beyond beyond today. But it was obvious to me that you are somebody who has had something to say and have had a rather sober and apparently clear view of what's going on for quite some time. And so I'm really appreciating your willingness to chat with me about that today. And so let me just stop there, see if that answers just who I am enough, or if there's anything else you'd like to know.
No, that's fine. Your course is similar to mine, and even the time frame is similar.
Yeah.
I began to become aware of these issues in the 80s when I was an editor at Time Life Books, and I was in charge of a series called Planet Earth. So I got to talk with the top Earth scientists in the world over a period of a year, and a very intense learning about it, and the result was horror. I mean, I just kept seeing a series of blind canyons that we can't get out of. So yeah, I appreciate very much your journey of discovery and your response to it. So.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Great. Great. Well, it's good to have you here. Well, let me then just do a brief official opening. And all right, welcome back to another episode of the Poetry of Predicament podcast. And these are extraordinary times. As we all know, there's even the people who try to keep themselves in caves or under rocks at this time know that we are in a time like no other in human history. And I'm particularly looking forward to this conversation because our guest today is Tom Lewis, who, as we'll find out, has been involved with this collapse-aware conversation for more than a decade now. And in some ways or another, he has roots that go back multiple decades. And we're going to find out about that history. And what I'm particularly interested in is Tom gives us a rare opportunity to really get some perspective over time that so many of the relatively new voices, and there are many now, gosh, it's just everywhere. But what is particularly of interest to me today is reading a brief article, Apocalypse Now, question mark, recently from Tom's blog. I got a clear picture of his awareness level now is as sharp as it has been for evidently decades. I'm also looking forward to hearing what he might be willing to share with us about what he saw multiple decades ago and how that's changed to now. And that sense of continuity throughout time, we have so little regard for it in our culture. And there is indeed, as there always has been, a tremendous amount of wisdom and important knowledge to be gleaned from someone who can give us some sense of timeline and perspective. So, Tom Lewis, I'm really glad that you're here and pleased to have you. And if I could just read a brief, kind of the broad sweep stuff that you put on your blog in terms of a bio, that you are nationally recognized and reviewed author of 6 books. And perhaps we'll get to hear particularly about Brace for Impact, perhaps your best known book, at least in this field. You've been a broadcaster, public speaker, and advocate of sustainable living. And of course, you're the primary operator of the Daily Impact website. And we'll be putting your contact information in the show notes for this particular episode. And what I'd like to ask first, Tom, is after I get done talking here, is to, if you would fill in some of the extensive history that you've had. And just before we hit the record button, you were talking a little bit about some of your earlier large-scale editorial positions that you've been in, and how you actually had woke moments, if you will, decades ago. So start us wherever you will in letting us know, how did you get to be where you are, writing things like this Apocalypse Now article? And welcome, Tom.
I often ask myself, how did I get here? The answer varies from day to day. But in terms of this subject, my awareness really begins in the 80s, when I went to work for Time Life Books. I'd been a broadcaster, journalist in Washington and other places. And one of my assignments soon after I started at Time Life Books was to take charge of a series called Planet Earth, of which I remain proud today. It's 20 years later, and it still stands most tests of accuracy, and each book was on a different aspect of the Earth sciences. And you talk about being awakened. I had the privilege of talking with some of the top people in volcanology and earthquakes and meteorology and climatology in the world for a period of 2 years. And it was the equivalent of a doctorate from a major university, I will tell you. And it was also extremely scary. I mean, this was just a few years after the Cuyahoga River caught fire, a few years after Rachel Carson's Silent Spring hit some of us on the head. And things were very much in a flux, and the effects of such things as industrial agriculture, the effects of such things as depletion of aquifers and the dead zones at the mouths of all the world's great rivers, and the garbage in the ocean, and even there was a sign or two of awareness of global warming, although not much that early, but the first article I wrote about global warming appeared in National Wildlife in about 88, I think.
Mm-hmm.
So working on the subject, you couldn't avoid becoming aware that something was really, really wrong here. And over time, now I will have to say this, in the 80s, when these things were becoming public knowledge and being discussed, there were many reasons to be somewhat optimistic that we could engage with and mitigate these problems.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of interesting people were working on the problem. One of my stories that I tell in the book is that under Richard Nixon, the United States Congress, prodded by his science advisor, passed a resolution saying that there would be no pollution of any kind into any U.S. waterway by 1980. This was done in 1969. And the basis for that was the fact that a person, that science advisor, had solved the problem of handling urban sewage with no effluent going anywhere. Solved it. But the real story is how industry just buried that solution and rolled back that resolution. And it is today, 20, 30 years later, as if it never happened. it did happen. It's on the record. It's a problem that not only could we have solved, we did solve, and then rejected the solution. We didn't reject the solution. The real estate developers and the millionaires rejected the solution. So first, like I say, in working on the planet Earth, I became aware of the myriad problems. And then as I looked at the world with that new awareness, I became aware that we were not engaging. We were not only making no progress, we weren't even starting to deal with any of these problems. For a time, I was a raving activist and joined organizations and made speeches and wrote articles and ran in circles. And by the end of the 90s, I was pretty much played out, and I saw no progress, and I thought, you know what? We've already lost this one. It's too late now. And everywhere I looked, it seemed to me that it was too late. And that's when I started work on Brace for Impact.
Yeah.
I was asked at a social gathering about that time by a lovely young lady in a black dress what I was working on, and I said, well, I'm working on this book about the end of the industrial age and the crash of the world's economies. There was a brief pause, and she said, is this where I smile brightly and edge away?
Yes, yes, exactly. Yeah. Well, I'm glad we both can laugh. And, you know, I've got a quote for you in a little while that I just recently ran into that I think you'll appreciate. It's one that addresses what in my experience is a deep loneliness that can occurs for me in waves as I do my work, that there's such a limited capacity in the average person to approach even a smidgen of this conversation. And people like yourself who've been at it for years and deeply at it for years, you know, that we're not just carrying around a smidgen. We've got huge amounts of distinctions and experience and very appropriate reactions to what we're doing to this planet and to ourselves. And that can be a lonely experience, as I just share my own experience of trying to talk with my own family members, with friends in my own inner circle, not to mention people out in public. And it's, I just wanted to plant a seed. Perhaps we can touch into that, perhaps a slightly broader point of, you know, people's reaction to the kind of stuff you've been writing about for quite some time. Tom, I'm wondering if you could spend just a little bit more specifically about what did you include in Brace for Impact?
It's in baskets. Talked about food supply, industrial agriculture. Talked about water shortages, and I forget all the rest.
Okay.
But I didn't put much emphasis in that book on climate change, except as a threat multiplier.
Sure.
That situation has changed since then, and climate change has become a threat in its own right. But I was, you know, we're running out of topsoil and abusing and poisoning what we have left. We're running out of water. We're running out of petroleum. And now it's ironic that what is threatening to absolutely crush the American oil industry is a surplus
Right.
and a collapse of demand instead of a collapse of supply. It doesn't matter. The demand will, if it comes back, then we'll almost immediately have a crisis of supply, because I propounded Lewis's law of consumerism, which is for the mathematically sophisticated, and goes as follows. If you have some stuff and only so much stuff, and you use some of the stuff every day, one day there won't be any stuff left. And it's amazing how we've been unable to understand that. The whole industrial age has been based on the availability of cheap, plentiful petroleum. It's like we stumbled into a candy store 100 years ago, and we've been gobbling candy ever since. And now we can't digest anything but candy, and we're sick and running out of candy.
Yeah.
And so that alone, I mean, that alone would be enough to lead you to conclude that what we have as a civilization now is not sustainable. But as I discovered, as I worked on these books, it's only one of several things that we're running out of. They're draining the aquifers to grow corn to use to make petroleum, a petroleum additive, and that requires as much petroleum to manufacture as it yields in energy. And this is regarded as sane. And people like you and I are regarded as crazy. Well, I reject I reject those definitions. But we were talking about people's reactions. And, if you look at some of the websites where people discover this subject and talk about it, and you get a lot of angst and depression and is suicide the only answer and stuff like that. And to such people, I want to say the following. Look, you're going to die, and I'm going to die. All of us are going to die. What is the saying? Life is a sexually transmitted disease that is not survivable. It has a 100% mortality rate.
Right.
So look, the knowledge, the certainty that you're going to die one day has not thus far plunged you into depression or made you incapable of living a decent life and helping others and enjoying music and whatever life means to you. Why should the notion that there is a major problem coming up for all of humanity, why should that depress you? It might not affect you. I always tell people I'm an age optimist about this thing. I believe I'm going to be dead before it happens. That's my optimism. I sincerely hope I am. But the notion that we should latch onto this, we are expert at avoiding the subject of our own deaths. We've been doing it since we're 10 years old.
Right.
I don't want to think about that. So do the same thing with this. If it bothers you, carry on. Just live well.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, maybe this is a good time to just share that quote I was telling you about earlier that ironically is from a book that's just about ready to come out from a fairly well-known author these days. I want to say Sarah Kenzi, or I think that's how you say it. And it's from her book that's about the age of Trump. And I'm not quite sure how it fits into that context. I have yet to read the book, obviously, but she sent out this particular quote. And I'd like to just run it by you, given that you've had decades of time to possibly touch into what she's describing here. This speaks really deeply to me in terms of what I was saying before about, I've lost some family members. I've lost some friends in terms of their reaction. I'm that guy. I'm that uncle that always brings up the dark. I'm what's Debbie Downer at the table. And I've since learned to really tone down my the volume and the intensity of any of my conversation, but it's still there. It's still there. Even the hint of it can mean that's it on this relationship. So again, let me just share it and see if it brings anything up for you. See if it causes any reaction to you. It's a terrible feeling to sense a threat coming. It is worse when the threat reveals itself to be real, especially when many of those you warned still dismiss it, and you do not know whether their reaction is rooted in apathy or doubt or fear. What is a warning in the end, if not a confession, a declaration of what you value and what you will fight to protect? To warn of a threat and be dismissed is to have your own worth questioned, along with the worth of all you strive to keep safe. But there's a price to be paid in persuasiveness too. I used to think that the worst feeling in the world would be to tell a terrible truth and have no one believe it.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm just wondering if any of that rings a bell for you. And we don't have to stay there if it doesn't quite ring for you, but again, it moved me pretty deeply. Anything that sparks for you?
Yeah, the nature of warnings, people have often said to me, and I'm sure to you, why are you so negative?
Yeah.
And I said, if I see you standing in the middle of the road and a truck is coming at 80 miles an hour and I shout a warning to you, would you consider that being negative?
Right.
Or would you consider that me trying to save your ass?
Yeah.
Well, that's what I'm trying to do here. And my point in the book, and can I also mention my novel, Tribulation, in which I try my hand at imagining the end of the collapse, is that it's not going to be possible to save everybody. People will say, well, what should I do? And I will say, well, you got to get out of the city. You've got to get to a piece of ground on which you can grow your own food and produce your own energy. Well, I can't do that. And I have to go around the tree a couple of times and say, you didn't ask me for a solution that would save everybody, because there isn't one. You asked me what you could do. And I believe that it is possible for anybody who really goes to work on the problem, like yesterday, to set up a situation that would be survivable through all of this and come out on the other side. But it would be damn few of us, because it involves sacrifice and work, number one, and those are out of favor in Mr. Trump's America. Not to blame him for that. That's a long-standing thing. But,
yeah.
But and you get the people who say, yeah, I'm gonna learn how to garden as soon as it gets bad. Well, no, you're going to be too late, because you don't learn to garden in a year or in 5 years. It takes a lot longer than that. And so I just feel a responsibility to say what I see. If I see a truck bearing down on you, I regard it as my duty to warn you if I can. And if you look at me and say, stop being negative, I will, and I'll step off the road and await further events.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I can appreciate that. Tom, I'm curious. You have a broad sweep of attention. It sounds like for decades now, and that shows up in that Apocalypse Now ? Essay that you did, the brief piece. I'm curious if there's anything that you'd like to say about the importance of, or the possible impact, either positive or negative, that you might be seeing in this coronavirus that's going on.
It's an excellent example of, you think you've imagined every way you can get hit, and then something comes up and hits you in the back of the head that you didn't know even existed.
Yeah.
The point of my essay, Apocalypse Now, ? Was, could this be the straw that breaks the camel's back, as it were? I mean,
Yeah.
so many things are under so much stress to keep things going, to keep the happy consumer stuffing his mouth and paying his bills and shutting the hell up.
Yeah.
So many things are almost off the rails, financially, agriculturally, that comes this. Now, is this the thing that might do it? It is the thing that might do it. So one day, one of those things will be the thing that does it. There's no doubt in my mind about that.
Mm-hmm.
But this aircraft carrier has tremendous momentum and is very difficult to turn, and it's slow to turn. And there are enormous forces at play to keep business as usual propped up.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, anytime you can create a bogus oil revolution,
mm-hmm.
like fracking,
right,
and keep it alive for 10 years and convince people, including governors and candidates for president of the United States, convince them that America is now energy independent. Well, you laugh. I have heard a sitting governor, and a candidate for president make that statement in public and not get laughed at. It is ridiculous. And for this 10-year revolution to be conducted by companies, none of which have made a single dollar in profit, that have incinerated borrowed money for 10 straight years,
mm-hmm.
and snowballed the entire world that this is some kind of technological marvel. What this is scraping with your bloody fingers the last drops of oil out of rock at the expense of everything else around you, and to no point in terms of financial gain.
Right.
And, people who can sell a con like that to the world are going to keep going for a while. Yeah. But then something like this comes along, but what the market has lost, 10,000 points in the last month, the Dow Jones. Mm-hmm. And that is a heavy blow. And at some point, the algorithms get overrun, the calls, margin calls come in, because these people are playing with borrowed money and other people's money, and at some point that avalanche can't be stopped. Mm-hmm. And the barons of Wall Street are in a panic now. I mean, if you ever saw panic, it was in the announcement they made this morning. So I fondly remember a meeting they had, a come to Jesus meeting for the main people in Congress just before it became apparent how bad the 2008 collapse was going to be. And I remember seeing them on television filing out of the room looking like they had each been delivered personal death sentences. They just looked awful. And that's when it was apparent that this was really going to be bad. I think that statement this morning from the Fed was the equivalent. This is really going to be bad.
Tom, I haven't seen any of the headlines this morning. Can you recap a little bit?
Basically, the Fed said they will do anything it takes to make whole the market by lending more money to banks and corporations.
Wow.
I suppose on the theory that it'll one day trickle down to the rest of us, And then meanwhile, the Congress is over there seriously considering bailing out the airlines, mm-hmm. who have been rolling in cash for 10 years and have been using the cash to buy in their own stock to enrich their investors with bogus stock manipulation. Now they want to bail out.
Right.
Because if they go bankrupt, who gets wiped out? The stockholders who got morbidly wealthy in the last 10 years.
Yeah.
Well, we can't let that happen. We're too rich to fail. You got to help us here. I sincerely hope they don't get it, and to their credit, the Democrats are fighting it, but they'll probably get it.
Yeah. Well, you've already covered one of the questions that I had for you, which is clearly, one way or another, this pandemic will come out of it some amount at some point, whether that's a year or two, or I have no idea. It's way beyond my ability to predict the future, to say when we're going to come out of it. And the question was for you, what do you see what do you see as the likely trajectory out of it, to just pedal to the metal, get everything back up and running, get back to pedaling as fast as we can? And I'm hearing you say, absolutely, that's where we're going to go. There seems to be no question, if I'm hearing you right.
Oh, I don't think we're going to get back to business as usual anytime soon. I believe that we're in for a depression.
Right. I guess what I'm saying is, there are those, not many yet, but there are a few who see this as a more opportune moment than any we've seen certainly in my lifetime.
Opportunity for what?
Opportunity to see that, in fact, there are chinks in the armor. There is indeed a possibility for us to radically shift the human operating system on the planet in a relatively short period of time. And that all was caused, obviously, by this coronavirus. So within approximately a month, we had a grand reduction in industrial output around the globe. I'm not saying it was done, excuse me, I'm not saying it was done without cost. There are immense costs, and people will die.
It also was not voluntary.
Right. I guess where I'm coming from is that we've had 40 years to try and do anything in the direction of transformative change.
Right.
And
I think that demonstrated what the effects of the crash of the industrial age will be, but it was not voluntary, and it will not be sustained. I mean, they're going to start those factories up the instant they're able to.
Yeah, that's really the cherry on top of what I'm hearing you say. That really puts a cap on it. Is you're saying that, yes, we're in a downturn. Yes, it's going to be tragic where it is and so on. It'll have all of its effects. And what you're saying is what's out beyond that is getting back into this business as usual flow as soon as we can.
I guess what I'm saying, I want to make a little clearer.
Yeah.
There's a difference between expecting a depression and expecting the actual crash of the industrial age. Those are two separate things.
Mm-hmm.
It may occur because of this. This could be it. I mean, this could have been the straw that broke the camel's back, but maybe not. I mean, what did they call it in Wall Street? There's a dead cat bounce. Mm-hmm. Which is a concept that seems oddly attractive to me. But anyway, that when something falls and hits the floor, it bounces. And I don't doubt that we can bounce back from this recession, depression that's going to come. Although I don't think it will be anywhere near as quickly as we did from the 2008 disaster.
Right.
This is going to be really bad. It's going to be global. And it's hard for me to imagine them bringing. I mean, they're dealing with funny money now. I mean, they're just imagining into existence quadrillions of dollars
Yes.
and making them available to the morbidly wealthy to play in the casino in Wall Street, you know.
Yeah.
I live in West Virginia, and I know people that live in trailers on 3-acre lots that are hungry 3 or 4 days a month until either the food bank opens or the check comes, that have no teeth in their head because they couldn't afford to get them fixed, that can't see a doctor under any circumstances because they can't afford it.
Yeah.
And I don't know how far you can go in making them jump over hurdles in order to get food stamps, and I don't know how much you can take away from them before they come out of those trailers with pitchforks and torches.
Yeah.
But I don't think it's going to be as much as the people in Washington think, because they don't know about these people. Apparently, there is enormous suffering in this country right now, deaths of despair and desperation, enormous.
And another word that you use in Apocalypse Now is rage. And I'm curious if we could stay there for a moment. Help me make sense of our remarkable ability to vote against our own best interest for decades, and then somebody taps into the rage about how badly the system is running and takes it further, and it looks like they're going to get reelected. Help me out here. What got us into that toxic spiral?
Well, a couple of things. I don't think it was quite as straightforward as that. We had strong evidence in 2016 that Bernie Sanders could have beat him. And that Bernie Sanders and Trump were appealing to the same people who are so tired of being ignored and pandered to by politicians when their situation just keeps getting worse and worse. They tout these GDP figures, and the economy is growing and the unemployment is low. Those are all lies.
Mm.
They're just plain lies. People are struggling. They're not retiring because they can't afford to. They're holding 2 or 3 lousy jobs in order just to pay the rent, which keeps going up. And to stand there and hold a news conference in Washington and say, well, inflation is under control, no problem there. There's no inflation, so the benefits don't go up. Yes, there's inflation. There's also gouging. You know, when these companies go out and take a vial of insulin that they used to get $100 for and charge $800 for it, and you tell me there's no inflation, get off my TV screen.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's rage, and there's controlled rage, and it's directed rage. The Republican Party has been expert at directing this rage for many, many years, since St. Reagan came along and said, government isn't the solution, government is the problem. And we must never raise taxes for any purpose ever again. And that bill of goods got sold in 1980 or thereabouts, and it has stayed sold till this day, till much of the Democratic Party is in the same leaking boat. And people want something to happen. Now, the Democratic establishment just succeeded in derailing Bernie again.
Yeah.
And they're going to go into this general election with Hillary too, another experienced centrist who doesn't have an idea that hasn't been polished and means tested and focus paneled to death. And so what the outcome will be, I don't know. I don't believe that Trump will be reelected, but I didn't believe he would be elected either. So there you go.
Yeah. Well, I'm afraid that you and I are on very similar pages with everything you just said. And I am curious. A lot of my work, Tom, is to provide support and resources, mostly inner resources for people who are on a daily basis involved with the conversation that you and I are having, this human-caused collapse of Earth and human systems. And I'm curious, Uh, well, I should just say the next thing about that, that many of those inner resources are about what's called self-regulation or co-regulation, meaning how skilled are we at returning ourselves to a positive state, to an optimal inner state, or at least a positive inner state, when we've been knocked off track, when something from outside of us is of such powerful either trauma or impact, or um, that basically we're just knocked off of our equilibrium. And to what degree do we have the skills to bring ourselves back and to be present again, present with the ones we love, able to be present in our day, maybe even have a little bit of a sense of humor, able to think straight, and then co-regulation being the ability to do that together. And I'm curious, how do you keep yourself in your equilibrium? How do you, on a day-to-day basis, how do you keep yourself sane? How do you keep yourself connected? And do you have the ability to some degree keep your heart open to the people you love around you, and to be present in your day? Let me
Well,
just start
first of
with
all,
that. Do you have some way of doing that with yourself?
none that is fail safe. Your assumption that I keep my equilibrium is not a good assumption. I don't.
Okay. Got it. Yeah.
I am subject to bouts of depression. There are months that I don't write
Mm-hmm.
the blog. That reasons range from just a block. Nothing makes sense to me anymore.
Yeah.
To a feeling that I've said it all before, and I'm just repeating myself in an empty room. And the thing is, for me, not any mechanism that I've invented, but to me, writing is a sickness. If I don't do it, I get all clogged up, and the pressure increases, and I finally have to. Not writing is worse than writing, so I sit down and start writing again. That's nothing I've figured out, but that's what keeps me going. And I have a wonderful small group of commenters that I enjoy hearing from, and they are so supportive and so caring. I've even had one of them from China track me down by email when I didn't write for a while to make sure I was okay. So I feel part of a fraternity, sorority, of people who care about this thing and talk to each other about it. So that keeps me centered much of the time. But it's impossible to conceive of this, of what might happen, will happen, and be in constant good cheer about it. But I remember I valued Scott Peck's writing.
Yeah.
And he had a saying that all mental illness begins with an attempt to avoid legitimate suffering.
Mm.
The fact that we suffer from this is not something to be avoided or corrected. It's the only human response to this is to suffer and then carry on. So that's what I try to do.
Yeah, I'm just making a note of that. I haven't thought of his work in a long time, and that particular one has stuck with me throughout the years. So I so appreciate you bringing it back. And
yeah, that wasn't from Road Less Traveled. That was from People of the Lie, which was not nearly as nice a book as Road Less Traveled. It was a more bitter book about the presence of evil and the face of evil being a perfectly tended suburban house. Anyway, I valued and I remember Scott Peck with a lot of fondness.
yeah, thank you for that. Great remembering. I just want to mention to you, for what it's worth, I certainly no pressure here, but just know that there's an ongoing open invitation for you to join us in the world that I have created around what we call safe circle calls. In this, my website is called livingresilience.net, and people get together. This next Tuesday is our first one where we're going to every Tuesday night, 6 to 7 p.m. West Coast time. And it's really just a chance for people of relatively like minds to get together in a safe container and just to be able to just share openly what's going on for them. And it's sometimes it is about grief and even despair and some of the harder aspects of processing these times. And a remarkable amount of the time, there's just this kind of warmth and even joy that can show up. It's not at all a happy, jack it up kind of a group, but there's this warmth and this kind of might start with gallows humor, but there's often a sense of joy of being able to connect with people who are on the same wavelength and with whom it's safe to share about having our hearts broken or having to let go.
Interesting.
Sense of loss when it's happening and so on.
You reminded me of something I wanted to mention when you talked about people at large not voting in their own interests and not taking corrective action. There is in this country a very powerful, strong movement toward regenerative agriculture among young people. I know many people involved in it, and I have met literally scores of young people. I remember a young couple that were from Oregon who traveled here to West Virginia to apprentice on a farm that was practicing permaculture, and they loved agriculture that was regenerative. You know, I grew up on a farm and I couldn't wait to get off of it because it was just injecting one chemical after another into the ground, and keeping the big machinery moving with gallons and gallons of fuel, and that agriculture is part of what has destroyed the world. But everywhere in this country, it's invisible because it's not part of the narrative that media has any sensibility for at all.
Yeah.
There are small acreages that are being converted to regenerative agriculture, permaculture, and there are, I suppose, other forms of it. And those are the people that have the best shot at getting through what's coming, because they can produce most of their own food, and if necessary, it wouldn't be easy, but it is doable. And running into those people and knowing them as I do, it gives me is the reason that I think some of us can make it. Most of us will not, but some of us can. But as I said a while ago to some of these people, I just want to say, look, we're going to live until we die. Get over it. Get on with it.
Yeah.
It's not about how you end up. It's what you're doing now.
Yeah. Yeah. Really good. Really good. I'm curious. You just kind of started yet again. You're out ahead of me about 2 or 3 questions ahead. I'm curious. You just mentioned about regenerative agriculture and how that has sparked you a bit. It's something that has shown up time and again in your conversations and your experience. And I'm wondering, are there any other, whether it's books or particular people at any level of our society and anywhere on the planet, are there particular elements that do inspire you, that do help you hold out a bit of positive?
Absolutely. I remember with electrical clearness, one of the first presentations I heard about permaculture, and I was there sort of interested and sort of paying attention, and this gentleman making the presentation talked about how soils are rebuilt and how abundance occurs when you stop trying to control nature and start working with nature. And he gave some examples, and he said, he was a plain-spoken man. He was a farmer, what you would think of when you think of farmer, not an orator. But he just looked at the crowd and he said, I swear to you, this can save the world. And it was like one of those lightning bolt moments. And I thought, you know what? He's right. Mm-hmm. And I started reading about it, and I realized that I'm too old. I've got the property in the country, and it would be 10 or 20 years before you can get this thing knitted together to make it work. And I don't have 10 or 20 years. So, but I can talk about it. I can advocate it. I've made sure my children know about it. And that's the one thing that gives me hope for that segment of humanity that has the sense to grasp it, to begin practicing it yesterday, and to hang on to it. And there are other groups in our society, the religious groups in Pennsylvania, the Amish, the Mennonites, mm-hmm. the Hutterites. They're probably not even going to notice when the industrial age crashes. Well, that's to overstate it a little, but they have the ability to soldier on. So do certain people living in the country who have. Mm-hmm. I have a friend who's got more canned vegetables and food in storage in 2 buildings that his family can live there comfortably without ever going to the store for the next 20 years. Those people will have a shot. Yeah. But people living in a condo in New York City are not going to have a shot. Yeah. And the way they kill the conversation is, well, lots of people can't do that stuff. Yeah, correct. And lots of people are going to die. Yeah. My favorite guy was somebody who got trapped by a TV reporter out in Los Angeles doing one of these man in the street things they do every 6 months or so. Are you prepared for the big one, the big earthquake? And they approached this dude and said, what preparations have you made for the big earthquake? He said, dude, I don't need to make no preparations. I got a 7-Eleven in my building.
Got it pretty much handled.
As they say, it's not the heat, it's the stupidity.
Right. We're just brushing up against another, what to me is a core piece of this conversation that perhaps gets less airtime than it did back when Paul Ehrlich really brought it to our attention. I'm curious if you have anything to say about population and how it has, from my perspective, been a core element in our predicament since before Paul Ehrlich wrote Population Bomb, and is more so now than ever. But that's my point of view. I'm curious if you have strong thoughts one way or another about population and where it's gotten to now.
I agree with you entirely. It's interesting that as we get deeper into the hard times that are upon us, it's interesting that the birth rate around the world is dropping. I learned from I was doing a story on the elk out west, and I was talking to a biologist who was another one of these aha moments. He said, the elk population varies a good bit according to the food source, but he said it isn't dramatic. He said it's simply the case that when the female elk falls below a certain percentage of body fat, she can't conceive. Mm-hmm. So it's not a matter of starving elk staggering out of the forest and dying at your feet. It's a matter of nature moving in silent and hard to observe ways to establish harmony. And then there's this biology 101 experiment where you put two mating mice in a cage and you put in the cage enough food for 20 mice, pretty soon you got 20 mice.
Mm-hmm.
You cut the food supply down to just only enough for 15 mice, pretty soon you're at 15 mice. We discovered gasoline.
Right. Yes.
And bam. And now we've overshot the carrying capacity of the world. And the other big, huge con is that growth must be perpetual. We live on this little blue marble and believe that economies and populations must grow forever and ever, amen. Now, how crazy is that? And why do we get called crazy when we point it out? Now, controlling population via government is pretty much impossible. I mean, China tried it. They've tried it both ways. They tried to cut it back, and then they tried to jack it up. Now they're scared because their population is aging and declining. Birth rate is declining. Nothing they did seemed to have any effect on the situation, right. Especially. Well, that actually isn't true because, I mean, they were, the one-child limit was rather brutally enforced. But my point is, certainly in a democratic country, you're not going to control population by government action, and we can scold people all we want. They're going to do what they think is rational, but we are way overpopulated as a country and as a planet, and since we're not going to fix it, and we're not, the crash is going to take care of that for us and expect us to say thank you.
Right. Wow. Well, this is something that I often include in these interviews for the podcast. And I don't know how comfortable you feel offering. It's really not advice that I'm asking for, but I try to imagine that someone is listening, a number of somebodies are listening to this podcast who are pretty new to this conversation. They don't have nearly your time and experience and historical context for it all. And they know that the pandemic's going on. I guess they got a shelter at home, if you will. So they don't quite know how to put this thing into context. Like what does it mean? What's out ahead? And I'm curious if you had the opportunity to speak with someone who's new to the conversation and was really confused about how to orient their attention, what might they be smart to start to pay attention to that they don't know to look at now. I'm wondering if you would have any guidance that you could offer, or any of your own experience that you could offer of how they could possibly be a bit more intelligent and a bit more oriented toward something to do with life and wisdom and a more wholesome way of being on the planet. If there are any elements that you'd like to share to somebody who's new to this conversation.
I think I would go back to what I said earlier. You understand you're going to die. You've always known that. Knowing that this is one possible way you might die, why would that make a difference to you? You see a story that the sun is eventually going to burn out, and you think about a cold, dead planet. Are you going to allow that to disable you? There's all kinds of stuff like that. There's all kinds of, if you're a religious person, you get told the world is going to end, and the rapture is going to happen, and all kinds. We've told each other these stories forever. deciding to let one disable you, it strikes me as is not something you ought to do. And I understand that's not helpful. It's like telling somebody who's depressed, oh, just snap out of it. You know, I understand that's not therapeutic in any sense at all. But I don't know what can be said that is specific to this case other than what I have said to my children and tried to say to myself: be of service. Mm-hmm. Be of service. Do what you do. For me, it's writing. Writing is what I do. So I do this no matter what. There's another quote that burned itself into my mind when I read it. On the day that the world ends, I hope that I will plant a tree. Hmm. If tree planting is what you do, then yes, plant a tree on the last day of the world. If you're a writer, write. If you're a singer, sing. If you're a carpenter, carpenter. And do that well and help others and raise your family and live as good a life as you can conceive of. And the end point will take care of itself. It's going to be imposed on you and on me and everybody else by a ruthless time scale. We know that. We've always known that we will not know the hour of our death, but we know the certainty of it. And so make time count. I think that's the answer for everything, including this. We can apply our minds and our logic and maybe even figure out a way to save ourselves. But other than that, carry on, snap out of it. What's the old line about the guy calls the psychiatrist who says, you say you have low self-esteem. What business have you having any esteem at all?
Oh man. Well, Tom
and
Lewis,
laugh. Did I mention that? Laugh.
Yeah, please. Yeah.
Keep laughing.
Okay.
That's my advice.
Yeah.
In the teeth of this thing, just there's parts of it are just so bizarre you can't do anything but laugh.
Yeah. Yeah. Tom Lewis, it's been an absolute pleasure to meet you. Really value what amount of your writing I've been able to read before this interview, and I'm happy to continue that thread. There you go, tribulation, and the links to these various things will be in the show notes.
Have it here.
Yeah, and I just
it's on
really
Amazon, by the way.
I just really want to thank you for generously, giving us a segment of your time today, and particularly what you bring in spades, which is this historical context and this clarity of vision that you've apparently had for quite some time that we still don't have nearly enough of even today. And
thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you for taking the time with us. And I hope against hope this is not our last time chatting. Perhaps we can catch up with each other just a few weeks down the line. Seems like we're on week by week time frames now, where our entire world has shifted in a way that no one could ever have guessed just a week before. So
except all the dozens of people who predicted exactly this would happen.
Yes, except for them. Those pesky people.
Yeah, right.
All right. Well, thank you so much for your humor and your sharing. And I look forward to our next time to be able to meet up just like this.
Enjoyed it a lot, Dean. Good to meet you too.
Yeah.
Thanks for watching another episode of the Poetry of Predicament podcast, produced by Dean Walker and the Living Resilience Alliance, www.livingresilience.net. Music today from Michael Hedges, as always, and also Port Blue Into the Sea.
Also available on our website, www.livingresilience.net, is a wide array of articles, online learning series, arranging group and individual resilience coaching, and sign up for our now weekly support gatherings online that we call Safe Circle.